theoretical background and introducing the prototype that we started off with. And then when we move on to talking about our current project, James is going to take over and talk about how we're trying to categorize place names. And then Uta is going to come in and discuss some of the ideas that we're thinking about for visualizations. Okay, I'm going to start with a quote from Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. She says, "But," she said, sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, "she felt herself everywhere. Not here, here, here," she tapped the back of the seat, "but everywhere." So how then to map that? So Mrs. Dalloway's words reflect the fact that in literary narratives, the sense of where one is may seem to have little to do with physical geography. Virginia Woolf herself argued against attempting to physically locate a place an author mentions in a novel, since she believed that a writer's country is a territory within its own brain. But Woolf's own liberal use of real-world place names, albeit used with license, undermines her claims and indicates the broader base of literary tradition and places in the world that provided graspable structure to the reader of a literary work. So while recent attempts to use GIS to map qualitative data raised concerns that this implied a problematically positivist agenda, it's enriched the field by leading to theoretical reflection on the situated nature of mapmaking practices and considerations about how to develop these in order to convey the complexity and fuzziness of such data. Joanne Sharp opposes humanist geography with critical geography, arguing that by revealing the situated nature of narratives and mapping practices, the critical turn is made untenable humanist geographers' claims that fiction presents universals of the human condition. So this echoes an earlier movement in literary theory from universalist to post-structuralist approaches that, along with Woolf, would deny the relation of place names to places in the world, with representations of a place merely signifiers circulating in a signifying system. So instead, this paper wants to argue for a middle way between those approaches, one that is based on embedded and embodied notions from cognitive science that human forms of representation, including language and, by extension, literary fiction, later embodied embedded nature. So we therefore argue that there's a meaningful connection between a place and its name, that place names possess semantic value, and that place names are both a useful means to analyse the dimensions of a literary work, and these works in turn enrich our perceptions of a place. Sharp's repeated stress just on difference and her situating of her viewpoint in opposition to humanist geography is too limiting a view of literary narrative spaces. A more expansive view of situatedness would stress not only differences but similarities between real and fictive places and between diverse persons' perceptions of places. In recent decades, evidence from cognitive science and cognitive linguistics has shown that the underlying physical and cognitive capacities that enable and constrain socio-cultural discourses entail considerable sharing as well as differences across human experience and perception. So arguably, linguistic representations map onto underlying physical features and processes in a way that functions practically within a society, so that even when sustaining and being sustained by fictions, those beliefs are nevertheless based on the physical characteristics in ourselves and in the world. So while we rely on approximate explanatory structures, these participate in shared and divergent aspects of being human and the world. So just as factual accounts of places are necessarily coloured by cognitive and socio-cultural biases, a fictional text's use of actual place names makes the narrative a kind of counterfactual scenario, an as-if account of the place that emerges through an author's and their readers drawing on and adding to the previous usages and associations of the place and its name. This means that there is both continuity and difference between accounts, which creates persisting and shifting patterns, whose continuities and divergencies provide meaningful insights. The experientiality that literary narratives transmit allows richer access to the ways in which we share and diverge in our experiences of places, while GIS provides new means to analyse what texts do and how they do it. Okay, so this is an example of the prototype palimpsest. So from the outset, it was intended to allow for micro-mapping and macro-mapping as described by Cooper and Gregory. So the imaginative retracing of a writer's physical movement, and also of the ability to give a larger body of text. So it arose out of the idea of creating an innovative new way of engaging people with literature, and it was originally just 200 manually created excerpts of literature which was based in the Royal Mile of Edinburgh. And the information thing, so we'd include a range of properties such as when it was published, title, weather, mood, day, when that type of information was available. And you can look at it from afar via a device, or it will come up as you're walking around the city, the different extracts of text. We entered the extracts by basically like doing pin, say it was in this area, and that meant that it would come up in this area of the city. But the initial development was basically undertaken with little funding and not too much expertise. So it's a bit limited and clunky, as you can see. And although the texts are intended to come up randomly, the same ones tend to recur. And the lack of tighteness of their match to the place suggests how fuzziness in certain circumstances is undesirable. Okay, so we're moving on to the current stage of the project now, which is an HRC funded project led by James. So it's an interdisciplinary research project. This is all of the team who's involved. The project's aim remains an exploration of the dimensions of literary Edinburgh, but it will now come through text mining expertise and visualization scholars as well. So the idea is to text mine a large corpora of text, and the team there in informatics are also developing the Edinburgh geoparser in order to enable it to deal with geo-referencing fine-grained place names in literary text, such as streets or buildings or local areas or vernacular terms like Old Wiki. So once this has been achieved, we'll then examine the collocations around the place names within and across different works in order to identify continuities and divergencies of place name associations. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to tell you about some of the categories.
Just to pick up on what Miranda was saying there, what we're going to end up with once we have done the data mining work is a huge data set of texts where the multitude of place names at different levels, so not just place names as in street names or areas, but also place names as in ranges of hills, particular hills, parks, ponds, statues. That all of these sorts of things come under the category of toponym for us and kind of fit in. So all of these will have been picked out, and they will obviously be geo-referenced as well. So we'll have this vast data set of stuff. And what we'll be wanting to do is to think about the various ways in which one would draw a sort of meaningful or have kind of meaningful engagements with the body of material that will have curated in that fashion. One of the problems, or one of the potential issues for us, is that toponyms, of course, function in lots of different ways and play lots of different kinds of roles, often simultaneously. Toponyms in literary texts are there as a form of anchorage to some extent. They anchor particular fictional spaces and realms within a kind of real world, if you could use that phrase, analogue for that particular fictional space. They help to generate the axes of the diegetic space of a narrative. They help to give you some sense of the actual dimensions of it, the spatial dimensions of it. And they provide also points of contact not only between the extra literary space that these toponyms also function in, but also other literary evocations of that space. And there are some locations which are particularly richly documented in this way. And Edinburgh is one of those. I mean, there are many others as well, but Edinburgh is certainly one of those. So, what we're trying to think about then is some of the kinds of functions, some of the sorts of dimensions, as it were, of the toponym, of the toponym in a literary text in this way. And we've been trying to work out a basic kind of categorization, which is at early stages in which we hope to refine and think more about. The first way that one might think about a place name here is its sort of grammatical placing within a unit of discourse. And so here you can see Edinburgh functioning as the subject, the main subject of the sentence, while London, to which it's being compared here, but it's being compared favourably to London, is allotted only a subordinate clause, so we're getting a kind of grammatical privileging. We've also got the sense in which place names function structurally as a crucial element in the story structure. A very well-known, or reasonably well-known instance of that would be James Hobbs' Confessions of a Justified Sinner, in which one of the key incidents of the novel, one of the major incidents, happens all around a site, an inn identified as the Black Bull, which is now gone and only vaguely geolocatable, it seems. And it functions there alongside unusually clement weather, unusually for Edinburgh that is, and providing the gathering point that helps to spark a riot. So that is a kind of key location, and the name Black Bull recurs again and again and again as the marker for that particular complex of story elements. There's also the sense in which place names function as aesthetically, I suppose, might be the right way to put it, a means of achieving an aesthetic effect or evoking an aesthetic possibility. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Edinburgh gets only a passing mention, but it's mentioned as a shorthand reference to the Enlightenment and indeed to Romanticism's ideals with its natural beauty and its orderly new town architecture as a kind of moment of respite, as it were, within the story. It acts as a device that indicates indirectly how lost the disenchanted Frankenstein has become to such pleasures, values and ambitions. But there's also, and these could all be going on, as I say, at the same time, a place name functioning as a kind of thematic element, a theme, I suppose, a semantic complex or macrocosm composed of themes and unified by a proper name. And we can see that in such texts as Robert Louis Stevenson's Edinburgh Picturesque Notes, in which he evokes precisely the ways in which the old town of Edinburgh becomes imbued by its historical and literary past, as well as its natural and architectural setting, and so on and so forth. And we find Stevenson using that semantic complex, the arrangement of meaningful possibilities there in such ways to sort of draw on that characterization of the city itself. What we see going on there can also be turned round, and here's an instance of that, which is from Irving Welsh's Train Spotting, where exactly that kind of approach to place names is turned around. I'm not going to read that, not only because my Leeds accent isn't quite up to it, but also because it's a little bit rich for first thing, well, just before lunch. Final point to mention before I hand over to Uta is the way in which the alertness and awareness of the different functions that place names can play, and the way in which the point of contact between text that the place name can provide, that can actually be turned in a story, in a narrative, and reflected upon explicitly. And we can see that in Muriel Sparks' Crime of Miss Jean Brodie. There's a very famous walk up through the old town with which Miss Brodie takes her girls on, and they pass through the old town. And we then get a kind of moment of reflection, a proleptic leap in forward, a moment of reflection on where Sandy, the character in whose perspective is being taken up there narratorially, when speaking to people whose childhood had been in Edinburgh, knew that there were other people's Edinburghs quite different from hers, and with which she held only the names of districts and streets and monuments in common. So that sense of the toponym as something which provides a point of contact, but also holds apart or falls apart or offers the sort of disjunctions between perspective that a novel like The Family of Jean Brodie is very clearly concerned with. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to draw on. That's the sort of thing we want to sort of anchor the project around, is the toponyms. But we're also particularly keen to find ways then, once we have kind of got a sort of spatialization of that, of visualizing that, which moves us beyond simply kind of anchoring it in a fixed and unchanging map service, and that's where we did.
So the project is still in a very early stage, so I'm going to share some very kind of preliminary thoughts with you on the visual aspects. So in particular, kind of looking at the audience we are trying to address, or the audiences we are trying to address, in which context they will kind of encounter, or we envision them encountering this data set. And also kind of looking at ways to represent the data going beyond maps, as James was hinting at. So a bouncing off the first prototype that was developed was a great starting point, but had some limitations, because we're actually trying to address as one audience academics, literary scholars that may use this data set to analyze the use of real-world place names in Edinburgh-related literature. And the current prototype, while it provides a desktop version, really, as you've seen, just gives you a broad overview of where certain literary works have been mentioned in relation to Edinburgh, but it doesn't really give you analysis tools. So what we're trying to do is kind of come from a bird's eye perspective on this data, map them geographically, but also provide analytical graphs and other visualizations, and hopefully interlink all of these so you can really come from different perspectives at the data set. And then we're also trying to address a more public, like general public audience, for instance, visitors of Edinburgh or people who live in Edinburgh with literary interests. And they, as we envision it, will be using kind of the mobile version, looking at the data set as they walk the streets of Edinburgh. So they come kind of from a frog perspective, as you will, so they see all the buildings and this kind of invisible literary layer we're trying to visualize. And for this, we're trying to create a visual interface that not only shows you text snippets in the location, where you're standing at, how they relate to that particular location, but also foreshadow, if I go further down the street, what kind of literary works may I encounter if I turn a corner, what will I see there? And in that way, kind of encourage visitors maybe to go off the beaten path as they explore the city, and inhabitants of Edinburgh to look at their city from a new perspective. So this is just like a hybrid image. So this is how the mobile prototype could be inspired. So you have like kind of an overview map, but then still kind of see your general surrounding and literary works in close proximity. So regarding the visual representations, we are of course creating kind of map-based visualizations that show the locations of Edinburgh that have been connected with literary works and the frequency of how often they're mentioned, but we're also trying to move beyond that, kind of drawing from this perspective that what we are trying to visualize is actually abstract data, because they are real-world place names. They have some kind of geographic encoding, but they are also used in a qualitative way with some distortion and kind of imaginary aspects to them. And regarding that, we are trying to kind of go maybe in a network visualization direction, where we try to create connections between place names as they have been mentioned in context in the literary works, and try to see what places have a strong connection from the literary perspective. Also maybe kind of creating these new landscapes where we will map place names against to their relation in the literature, but then also to their frequency. And this may result in kind of distorted maps of Edinburgh that have nothing to do anymore with the actual geographic structure of the city, but kind of as a literary landscape of the city. There's also a linear aspect to place names, obviously, because they're mentioned in certain order, so you could think, underground maps where place names are certain stations that the literature is covering, and you it's a very kind of dense network. Graphs, analytical graphs, I have to wrap up. And then what we also kind of throughout the project trying to consider is aesthetic questions, because of course this, we're dealing with literature here. So how can we visually represent this kind of like feeling or emotions or kind of iconic aspects of this literature, kind of moving beyond the normal Google Maps view or GIS view, but kind of trying to visualize or use timelines that are more kind of iconic and can maybe convey some emotions that also reflect in the literary works. That's it. Thank you.